Thanks, everybody. There's nothing worse than speaking to a group at 3 o'clock in the afternoon when you've already had a long day. So if you nod off, it's okay. Don't worry about it. But I bring you greetings from the Cathedral and from all of the folks there. I've been the dean for 6 years now. It's a wonderful place to serve. And I know many of you from all over the country, and some even from Canada, I understand, which is fantastic. And just know that you have a friend in the Cathedral. We take very seriously wanting the Cathedral to be reflective of the whole church in the best ways possible. So always know that you have a home there, and that if we can support you in your ministry, that's what we see the role of the Cathedral to be, to support ministry, if we can help in any way we want to. So thanks for being with us. So I am going to talk about, what it's like preaching in this new normal or this new time that we're in. I don't have any definitive answers. If anyone tells you they have definitive answers about how to preach in this time in which you're in, they don't know what they're talking about, because there really aren't any. We're feeling our way along during this time period that we're in. We're feeling our way along, trying to figure out how to feed our flock, how to move our flock, how to motivate our flocks, how to challenge our flocks in a very different landscape than we've had in past years. So I'm going to throw out some things that have been useful to me and some things that I think about in that process, and I hope that they will be useful for you. So let me tell you a little bit about me. I actually was a PEP graduate in 1990. I think it was the second class of PEP, and no one knew who the hell they were. It's just, your dean would come to you and say, you got picked to go to this preaching thing. And you were like, okay, where is it? It's in Wisconsin. Okay, let's go. But it has served me well all these years. I learned a lot when I went, and I hope you will as well. And I found it incredibly valuable. I've been ordained about 32 years, served parishes of all different size, from family size, from mission size up to corporate size or resource size parishes, and now a cathedral. And as I said, I've been the dean for about 6 years. I've got 2 grown kids. One lives in Washington, D.C., my son, and my daughter lives in Los Angeles, which is too far away for her father's, but she loves it. And my wife is an Episcopal priest as well, and she's been ordained 30 years and has spent the vast majority of her time in education. She was the chaplain of St. Christopher School here in Richmond for a long, long time. I think total about 20 years over 2 different stays. So we have a wonderful ministry together, and we're empty nesters, and I must say we love every second about it. So in a very short time, I'm going to talk about a couple of things. How do we talk about preaching in this time in which we live, and to share a few things that I've learned, and then to open it up for some questions from you all. So please don't hesitate to interrupt me, or if you want to save it to the end, we'll do that. I'm going to talk till about 3:30 or so, I hope, if I plan my notes right. If you haven't already realized it in your preaching, in the times in which we live, it seems to me that everything we say from the pulpit is now political. Even if you're trying not to be political in any way, shape, or form, everything is political. Everybody is hyper-sensitive. Everybody is in their camp. Everybody sees just about anything we might say as a touchstone for some ideological issue going on. And we have to realize that when we step up into the pulpit. And there are going to be times when we want to be overtly political and times when we don't. But your congregation is going to hear it one way or the other. And so there's not a whole lot to be done about that. I just raise it as something for you to think about as you're up there in the pulpit. I know at the cathedral, 40 to 70% of the congregation every Sunday are visitors. And we get everybody from across the ideological spectrum who come in that building. And I cannot tell you the number of times I've preached a sermon and been standing outside greeting folks, and someone will come up to me and say, "That was way too progressive. That was way too left. You were way too liberal in what you said." And then someone else would come up to me and say, "Wow, you didn't say enough at all. You were way over here in what you said." And you realize that when you're preaching to folks across this spectrum, that's just the way it's going to be. People are going to be quicker to turn you off because of that. So one of the tricks for preaching in this time is, how do you keep people open to what you're saying? If everything's hyper-politicized, how do you keep people open to what you're saying? And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. I always like to say that the gospel, from my point of view, the gospel is always political. The gospel never needs to be partisan. What do I mean by that? Well, the words of Jesus have deep political ramifications. Love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you, do good and lend, expecting nothing in return. I mean, just those few phrases have all kinds of implications. But it need not be partisan. And one of the things that I warn you about, and that is something that I think about a lot, is that if your God looks too much like your political party, then you probably got an idol you're dealing with, and not the God we worship. And so I think it's important that we be sensitive to that. And I try to be sensitive to that in every sermon that I give, because I have definite opinions. Louis Leon, from St. John's, who was the rector of St. John's in Washington, D.C., the church where presidents often come and worship, when he talked about what it means to be political in the pulpit, he would say, you have to ask yourself, if you're going to mention Trump, or you're going to mention Obama, or you're going to mention Biden, or someone like that in your sermon, you have to ask yourself, if they were sitting there in the congregation, would you say their name? And for him, that's a real possibility, or likelihood. And he said, if the answer to that question is honestly, no, I wouldn't, then you shouldn't when they're not. And for me, what that means is I have to be careful about political potshots. In Washington, D.C., everybody assumes you're going to be political all the time in everything you say. So I always try to be very careful about that. For me, it's never about the person in my sermon. If I'm going somewhere, if I'm going to talk about immigration, if I'm going to talk about gun control or gun violence, more likely in a sermon that I think it's really important to deal with after 19 children get killed, I'm never going to mention a person as far as a leader goes. I'm going to mention the virtue that I'm trying to talk about, or the ideal I'm trying to lift up, or the core gospel message that's important to be heard. I think it's important in our sermons that we try hard to rise above. One of the things that I think is especially important in the time in which we live, and I'm going to move away from the political question right now, is that because people are so polarized in our culture, when we're dealing with our congregations, I think it's really important in our preaching these days that we take the opportunity to try to move people out of their fishbowls. Try to encourage people out of their ideological stances. Not by arguing with them or making some argument about how they ought to think differently. No, I'm actually talking about this whole idea of repairing the breach, this whole idea of in your congregation trying to preach sermons that encourages your people to listen to one another, to see beyond ideology when they're dealing with each other. I think that's really hard to do, but it's important because I find many parishes, they're just like this, and nobody wants to talk to anybody about anything. When one of the jobs we have is to proclaim the reconciling love of Jesus Christ. And in doing so, to help people to see how important it is for them to move to be open to the other. So, I know that for many of us, to be an Episcopal priest means you listen to NPR and read the New York Times. I think it's part of the ordination vows, isn't it? Right? But I worry about us. I worry about the church being its own fishbowl. So I encourage you, I do this on a regular basis, to watch Fox. Watch it. Don't just get mad about it if you disagree with it, but ask yourself, what's going on here? What is moving people here? What is the underlying issue that is upsetting to folks? There are good people who watch Fox News every single day.
And read the Wall Street Journal.
And I read the Wall Street Journal every single day. I read the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post just to balance each other out. But by doing that, by pushing ourselves out in this way, it makes it, and to try to humanize what's going on with folks, what their needs are, what their lacks are, what their fears are. I think that's a great homiletical gift when it comes to trying to bring your people together in your parish. I've always said that our job as clergy is not to be right. Our job is to be faithful. And I think there's a big difference between those two. That's a whole different talk. I'll leave that alone. We cannot really speak to the people that God puts in front of us in the same vein until we've done everything we can to understand where they are, until we've done what we can to stand in their shoes. I think that kind of empathy with our congregations is one of the greatest gifts when it comes to us preaching. And it's one of the things I miss the most. Quite frankly, in every parish I've ever served for 25 of my 32 years, you spend enough time there, you know what's going on with the people. You know what they're struggling with, you know what they're suffering with, you know what makes them angry, you know what makes them sad, you know where the hot button issues are, you know all of it. And so when you're preaching, it affects your preaching, that your preaching can go much deeper with folks. When 40 to 70% of your congregation you've never seen before and you will never see again, it makes preaching to that group much harder. I find that I end up now spending twice the amount of time writing a sermon as I did in parish life. Just because I often miss having that deep sense of community that gives me grounding from which to speak. So trying to stand in the shoes of your folks is really important when it comes to preaching in this day and age. Because I think it's too easy for us as clergy, especially, I don't know, at least for me, as I was coming out of seminary, I'm pretty sure I had most of the answers to most of the problems. And I was going to tell people too. And clergy, if nothing else, we have healthy egos, don't we? We have some healthy egos. And I think our preaching today calls for a greater amount of humility and openness than almost ever before. Because if any group of people is going to help to stop some of the polarization in our country, or to help move beyond it, or to help heal it, it needs to be us. Next point. I think a lot of folks, and you probably experienced this already, are coming out of this pandemic, question is, are we coming out of it, are moving through this pandemic, and they're traumatized. They've been traumatized by death, by loss, by emotional and mental strain, having to be alone all that time, by fears about their jobs, about fears of what's going on in our nation. And I think we have to be cognizant of the trauma that they're experiencing. So in this day and age, for me, one of the things that I think is most important in our preaching is to give them some good old grounding in the good news. Christians are people of hope. We have always been people of hope. And if there was ever a time when we need to not only challenge our folks, but give them a deep sense of God's hope, now is it. So I encourage you to, as you think about whatever trauma you might have experienced coming through COVID. And I don't know about you, but it's really hard sometimes to point to the hope that guides my life. When I witness all of these folks being killed, I had to preach this past Sunday, and trying to stand up in that pulpit and say something hopeful was a real challenge. And I'm not sure I even did it. But it's important that we remember our folks need that. They need the grounding in the good news. They need the sense of hope. They need to know that if we hold together with one another, if we do the work we need to do, that things can get better. That's what God's promises are about. Bishop Curry talks about the liberating, life-giving love of God. That's what we need to make sure we're sharing these days with our folks. He's so good at doing that too. A friend of mine once said that compassion without confrontation is sentimentality. Compassion without confrontation is sentimentality. And confrontation without compassion is rarely heard. And I think both of those are absolutely true. Jesus was about both, wasn't he? Deep compassion and love, never afraid to speak the truth. But to hold both of those together is very, very important. For me, one of the deepest lessons that I have learned throughout my career is that people in your congregation are not going to be able to hear you until they trust you. It doesn't matter what you have to say. It doesn't matter how right you are on the subject. If they don't know you love them, they're just going to turn you off. So for me, what that means, and has always meant, and which is incredibly almost impossible at the Cathedral now, another thing that drives me nuts, is that those relationships are forged by being in people's homes, being in people's hospitals rooms, celebrating with families, crying with families, going through the day-to-day stuff where people that you don't agree with and who don't agree with you, who think you're too liberal or think you're too conservative or whatever, they know you love them in spite of the fact that you don't agree with each other. And if you can get that folks to understand that, then they can hear almost anything you want to say to them because you're saying it out of love. Too often I've seen too many clergy who have come into a parish setting and just think right off the bat they're going to drop some heavy thing on the parish or have some definitive statement that they're going to make about a parish or something they believe in strongly. And sometimes that's called for. Sometimes you've got a really dysfunctional place and you kind of have to lay the law down when you start in a place. But most of the time, that doesn't work. It just alienates. All the assistants that I've ever worked with, who've ever worked with me, I always told them when they first came on, you have to earn the right to be prophetic. You can be prophetic, but they're just not going to hear it until you earn it. And the way you earn it is to build their trust and their respect. I love the fact that Bishop Curry, when he preaches, he's always so good at addressing difficult topics. You know, Bishop Curry, what is every sermon Bishop Curry preaches about? Right? I mean, every single one of them. I mean, it's not like he's got 3 of them, he's got 1. Right? But have you ever noticed that in the midst of that same sermon, he can say some really difficult stuff about some difficult issues, whether it's racism or whether it's gun violence, whether it's immigration or, you know, all of that. But he can do it in such a way that he has built it around this central message of love that it enables people to hear it. And I find that deeply inspiring. Plus, he's just so damn charismatic. Okay, I'm running out of time here. William Sloane Coffin once said, I love this quote, "Unity is not based on agreement. It is based on mutual concern." Unity is not based on agreement. It is based on mutual concern. You can build a healthy parish community that is together, that loves and cares for one another, but you don't have to agree, as long as people know that there is mutual concern. And so whether you're building that in the pulpit or elsewhere, I think that's deeply important, especially during this time in our lives. So my personal rule when it comes to preaching these days is I preach what I need to hear. Maybe that's pure egotism, I don't know. But if I figure if I need to hear it, if I'm struggling with it, or if I need to be pushed on an issue, on something, then maybe other people are feeling the same way. For example, not too long ago, I preached a sermon about, about white privilege. Wrestling with the fact that for a lot of folks, white folks, they don't know what it is. They don't know that they have it. They don't know that they're living into it, even though they don't know that they have it. And so I preached on the questions around it and the issues of it, because I was preaching to myself. And it was very effective, because I didn't do it out of a sense of, here, I'm going to tell you what this is, but out of a sense of my own struggle with it. So preach what you need to hear. And always ask yourself, is this something I ought to preach from the pulpit, or is this something better I ought to hold in a forum? You know, there's a difference between those two. Is this a topic that I ought to preach on from the pulpit, or is this a topic better served in a forum setting, or in a newsletter setting, in some other setting other than the pulpit? I'll give you an example. In 2003, after Gene Robinson was consecrated, my parish in Richmond was split. Very much split down the middle on that issue. And I had very strong feelings about that issue. But I knew that the parish was close to coming apart over it. There were a relatively small number of folks who were really in favor of it. There were a relatively small number of folks who were really opposed to it. And there was a whole bunch of folks in the middle who were really confused by it. So what I decided at the time, right or wrong, is that I wasn't going to talk about that from the pulpit. It was too hot. It was too raw. It was too fresh. And that it was better served in forum education conversations. You know, we got to remember, right, that folks come into church carrying immense burdens. We may not see them or we may not know them, but they're carrying pains with them, carrying their own struggles. And not only do we need to confront them with the truth of the gospel, but we need to feed them as well. So I decided that in that time when the congregation was so fragile, I would not preach on that issue. Rather, I gathered groups of 150 or more at a time, and we would talk the issue out. And I would be very clear about where I stood on it. But it was a different setting. Always ask yourself, is this something that ought to be from the pulpit right now, or is this something that's better done somewhere else? Okay, I'm cutting things out, you'll be happy to know. Never be afraid to be vulnerable. How many people were told in your preaching class that you should never talk about yourself? Were you all told that? We were told that.
Oh yeah, back in our day.
So if they don't teach that anymore, I'm really glad. But we were taught, never mention yourself in a sermon. Ever. Sermons are not about you. And they taught it for 5 minutes. Oh, thank you. They taught it for a very good reason that, you know, we do have egos, and we're not supposed to make it about us. It's supposed to be about the gospel. But at the same time, if you're willing to be vulnerable with people and share with people your struggles, that you don't know the answer to a question. If you can say, I don't know, in a sermon, that can be a very powerful and rich thing. We had Brene Brown at the Cathedral some years ago. And you know, Brene's done all this work with, you know, vulnerability. Let me tell you, it was absolutely fascinating. 3,000 people came to the cathedral that day to hear Brene preach. They were standing outside on a line that went out to Wisconsin Avenue. After the passing of the peace, when I was doing the announcements, I asked how many people were there in the cathedral for the first time. Now, of course, I didn't count, but I would tell you anecdotally that I would say 80% of the people in those seats had never been in the building before. But it was the power of her conversations about vulnerability that were deeply touching people, and her own willingness to be vulnerable. Finally, unless you're especially gifted, which I'm not, writing a sermon on a Saturday is a bad idea. But I'm sure you guys know that. I'm sure you know that already, right? Not a good idea. One of my first priests I served with when I was a seminarian, he'd been ordained like 58 years. He'd been at this parish 40-some years, and he would never write a sermon. He would just stand up in the pulpit on Sunday morning, pick a stained glass window, and talk about it. Gary would have just freaked out at that. It was horrible. That's right, that's why we have this, exactly right. But let's be honest, there are going to be lots of times, especially in this day and age, when the sermon you wrote on Thursday or Friday or Wednesday, Saturday comes and you got to toss it out the window. Do you all work on that here? You should. At some point in your life, you should practice that. That you've got a sermon already written and you need to blow it up. What are you going to do? 19 children are killed in Uvalde, Texas. And you've had a sermon that you've written, but that's not going to work anymore. Then you're going to have to rewrite it. That's a big task, but it's an important one. Don't go into the pulpit tone deaf. Even if you've worked hours and hours and hours on that thing, set it aside. The 5th Sunday of Easter year C will come around in 3 more years, right? And you can use it then, but adapt. Adapt and be honest with your folks. That's so important. The rule of thumb is if there's something that's going to be prayed about in the prayers of the people, it ought to have some piece in your sermon. Right? I mean, maybe not if we're praying for Ukraine every single Sunday or something like that, right? But if you're going to pray for something that has happened that week that we need to lift up, that the people need to pray about, you should address that in your sermon.